Everyone hits a bump in the road. What do you do with it? Be inspired as we explore the ways people experience, navigate, and manage the ups and downs and twists and turns in this road trip called life. Welcome to another episode of Bump in the Road. The basic podcast is always free. We also have a premium subscription called Bump 2 that lets you listen in on extended behind-the-scenes conversations with our guests. Check it out at www.bumpintheroad.us. Martha McSally is a remarkable woman. She graduated from the Air Force Academy and became the first woman to fly in combat, where she logged 325 hours across 6 deployments in the Middle East and Afghanistan. She's been a U.S. Congressperson and a Senator. But even beyond these achievements, her story is one of courage. Her never-give-up attitude is best summed up in her quote, "Do things afraid." Come join us for a fearless discussion. Martha, welcome to Bump in the Road. I was so totally captivated by the first chapter in your book. I was wondering if you would share it with the audience.
Sure, Pat. Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to the conversation and just the discussion and hopefully encouraging others on their own journey. My book is called Dare to Fly: Simple Lessons in Never Giving Up. And I share in my opening chapter when they, first cleared me for takeoff to fly the A-10 Warthog, which if your listeners don't know what that is, you can look it up. It's this beautiful plane, that single seat. It was built to protect American troops on the ground on the front lines. It was actually built to go if, we had Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact, where we needed to be in close contact, low altitude, in the threat to protect Americans in firefights on the ground that were often very complex, on the move, and very close, to the enemy and the friendlies. And it was built to survive. It was built with one seat, though. There were no two-seat training models. And when I went through training, there were no simulators. So I get cleared for takeoff having never flown this airplane before. I was a qualified pilot. And this was a 10-year journey in the making from when I had this dream in my heart to become a fighter pilot. And finally, the law changed. That was, against the law for women to be fighter pilots, and the policy changed. And so here I am, my dream's about to come true. But I was just afraid, like anybody doing something new and dangerous that they've never done before. Even though it was a culmination of so much of my hard work and grit and my dream. But I remember like it was yesterday, and they said clear for takeoff. And I had to decide whether I was going to take off afraid or whether I was going to give into the fear. And so I open up with that story just to share my perspectives of courage and how you build courage. And I didn't come out of my mom's womb with courage, or the kind of courage to take off that day or later fly in combat or command a fighter squadron in combat. But I started to build a pattern as I look back in my life of not allowing fear to have power over me and learning how to do things afraid. And so I share that journey and many other lessons in my book. It's not an autobiography. It's really about sharing things that I learned in my unique experiences to equip any reader, any age, any gender, just whatever they're dealing with, to find their path, to thrive in the darkness, to meet their full potential and not let fear have any power over you. So Dare to Fly. It's great. Just poured my life into the messages in that book.
Oh, the messages are great. One of the things I was really curious about is how do you learn to fly in the military? Do they start you off with simpler airplanes, or do you go right into a jet?
No, so what they first do is they put you through a very basic screening program, which is pretty similar to if somebody was going to get a private pilot's license. You fly the equivalent of a little Cessna, and they just want to screen out before they send you off to a base and move everything you own with you for a year of what they call undergraduate pilot training, or that's what they called it at the time. Before they do that, they have a little mini screening program to make sure you have some basic compatibility and, motion sickness, or just like fundamental skills to be able to learn how to fly. So you then graduate from that. And I did that when I was at the Air Force Academy. And then later on, when I attended pilot training, it was a 1 year program. And at the time, it was two different aircraft. The first 6 months was in what's called the T-37, which is very old plane we no longer fly, but it's side by side plane with an instructor pilot in the cockpit with you. Very maneuverable, and you're just learning the very basics of flying, taking off and landing, maneuvers, instrument flying, formation flying, just all the fundamentals. And then we moved on to a supersonic jet called the T-38. And that's a plane that the Thunderbirds flew many, many years ago, a very, high performance airplane. And that's front to back. So the students in the front, the instructors in the back. And it's just, again, varsity level instruments, formation. You do a lot of aerobatic training, maneuvering, understanding all aspects of aerodynamics. And you're doing a lot of classroom training as well. You kind of need to know how to almost build the airplanes, deal with any sort of emergency, all the systems, the hydraulics, the electrics, the engine, how to be able to confront all that. If you're flying solo, you're the pilot, co-pilot, you're on your own. So you have to have that fundamental understanding. You have to have a strong understanding of physiology. So there's a lot of flight medicine elements of, how the body sustains under those conditions, whether it's oxygen deprived, if you get hypoxic, or pulling G forces where there's risk of passing out. So it's a lot of schooling and a lot of flying. And then when you finish after a year, you get your pilot wings. So they pin on your wings. It's a pretty amazing milestone. And then you head off into whatever training for your very specific plane you're going to fly. So that's a whole nother level of training. For me, I was an instructor pilot. I picked to be an instructor pilot for a few years because Congress had repealed the law that restricted women from being fighter pilots. Yes, it was against the law for us to fly fighters when I was at the Air Force Academy, but they repealed the law while I was in pilot training, but the Pentagon wouldn't change its policy. So I thought it was going to change soon. And I thought if I went off to fly, say, tanker, cargo, other planes, they wouldn't cross me over to fighters. So I wanted to kind of keep the dream alive. So I picked an assignment as an instructor pilot and did that for a few years. And they finally changed the policy, and I was selected in that first group of women who earned a fighter, but just they wouldn't give it to us because we had ovaries, so it was just the way it was at the time. I finally was able to go through the path to fly the A-10. Then you go through some other training on introduction to fighter fundamentals, anybody going to any fighter aircraft. And then you go through your training in the airplane. And so it's extensive training. It's then you also have survival training, both land survival, water survival, how, if you were in enemy territory, how you evade capture, how you survive out there, and then how to resist if you're captured, and interrogation. So there's all this intense training. They drag you behind a truck to learn how to, in high winds, if you parachuted, learn how to get out of it. And they drag you behind boats so that you can do that in the water. It's really glamorous stuff. Just kidding. It's important training for any contingency if you're going to fly, obviously, a fighter in combat.
What's the biggest thrill of flying a plane like that?
It's interesting. I wouldn't use the word thrill because it's when you're in the plane, you're not like going for a ride. You have a mission. And so you are very focused on preparation for that mission, and the planning for it, and dealing with any contingencies, and then inspecting the airplane, and then going through your checklist to get to then the combat zone once you get airborne, and then focused on the mission. Come back, make sure you can get back and land safely, and then debrief everything. And so, but I will say there are times where, you're coming back, say, even for a training mission here in Arizona, out on the ranges, and you see these, this gorgeous sunset as you're on your way back, getting ready to come into land. You're just like, oh, you can't explain to your friends and family. This is the view from your office window, and so you have these moments of just being blessed with such a beautiful perspective, on God's creation out there. But that's usually then you have to get back to focusing on the mission. And so it's not really, Some people think about it like, oh, like a roller coaster ride, a fighter jet ride, it's an adrenaline thing. I mean, for us, it's very much a mission and a purpose thing. But we do have these moments of it's kind of surreal that we get these opportunities.
If you would talk a little bit about your path through the Air Force Academy and the absolutely gut-wrenching series of events that happened for you to become a fighter pilot. I mean, I read that and it was just like one thing after the other just kept blocking you. It was incredible.
Yeah, I feel like for whatever reason, the calling in my life is always the hardest path. It's the most arduous with many obstacles. I mean, some of which I probably put up myself, but just one thing after the other. So to go back a little further, as the youngest of five kids, grew up in a middle class family. I was just incredibly blessed to have, a stable family environment. My dad came from very humble circumstances, and he started working at the age of 8 and never stopped. And his dad passed away before he was born, and his mom passed away when he was a teenager. And some people believed in him and helped him get a work study scholarship. So he was first to go to college, in his family, and then served in the Navy and used his GI Bill to further his education. And he just had the values we grew up with were about paying it forward, hard work, education, service, and paying it forward to others with gratitude. And my dad passed away very suddenly when I was 12, and it deeply impacted my life in very profound ways. Maybe we could talk about it a little bit later, but I just want to lay the groundwork. So now my mom is a single mom, five kids, goes back to school and then back to work. And I'm just trying to find my path in those very volatile years anyway. My dad, before he passed, among other things we got to talk about in between heart attacks. I mean, he was there one day, we were hanging out together as a family, and then he was gone within 24 hours. But he, among other things we talked about, and he knew in his spirit he was going to die, he told me to make him proud. And that propelled me on a path, sometimes unhealthily, of, really being driven by that in the midst of my grief. So trying to excel, but also deal with the screaming in my soul as a young person and the loss of my dad. And as I was, looking for opportunities to go to school and not saddle my mom with debt, I ended up going to the Air Force Academy. But you're 17 when you make these decisions. If any of your listeners have teenagers, you understand you're flaky at that age. Maybe some kids, understand exactly where they're going and what they're doing. I didn't. I look back, and I think there was something deep inside me saying this is a good path for me to channel myself, to challenge myself, to pay back in service. But I wouldn't have said that at the time. And so off I go to the Air Force Academy, and I didn't have any idea what I was getting into. I mean, I was in the ninth class with women, and they told us to bring our own combat boots and bras. That was like, that's the only thing they said they couldn't fit us for. So you think about, for anybody who like left home to go to college, for example, like it's a scary time anyway. There's no such thing as 13th grade. I tell young people all the time, right? So you're leaving into a new chapter in your life. Sometimes you're leaving geographically, you're leaving your friends and family behind. So I'm getting on an airplane from Rhode Island, to go out to Colorado. And on top of all that, when you get off the plane, in my case, they're yelling at you, that you're in basic training. So it's not even like it was this welcoming thing in the midst of all your fears. And again, they had, I was in the ninth class with women, and there was still a lot of challenges with integrating women. And I wanted to be a doctor when I got there, but I found out I wanted to go to medical school. I was motion sick when I was a kid. I had no desire to fly. And I found out when I got there, for the first time in my life, I was told I couldn't do something just because I was a girl. And it just pissed me off. And because it was against the law for women to be fighter pilots, I just couldn't believe it. I was like, not in America. I wouldn't have said it this way, but we picked the best man for the job, even if she's a woman, is what I say now. And so I said, well, you know what? That's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to become the first woman fighter pilot. And I put this dream in my heart, and it was taking my kind of rebellious spirit into a positive way to, desire change. And people laughed at me and said, it's against the law. And I said, we live in America, laws change. And I'm just going to keep this dream in my heart. And I had nothing to do with the change, but I just kept dreaming it would change. And I kept blooming where I was planted and not having a chip on my shoulder, and just keep building my expertise as a pilot, as an officer. And I blessed I was in the right place at the right time when the door finally opened. But that was not without obstacles, as you read in my book. I mean, I was too short to even have, a pilot qualification. And then my hand broke. Like it was just one challenge after another to even get cleared to fly any plane, never mind a fighter plane. But I am an endurance athlete, and resilience is in my DNA. And so I just kept persevering, kept believing, and kept pushing. And eventually the doors open, and I was blessed to go through it first.
Now, you mentioned that your father had a big impact on you.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think you said is you realize the fragility of life.
Yes.
That's an incredible lesson to learn at such an early age.
Yes. And I think I learned it in my spirit before I was able to really even communicate it, if that makes sense. Like my whole world was shaken at that difficult age anyway. For if anybody again has adolescence, it's a tough time. And I just was like, what just happened? I remember getting on the bus the next year. I was changing schools to junior high. And I just remember, again, he's dealing with grief. I remember looking around like, he is a father, she is a father, why does everybody have a father here but me? And just like everything was shaken for me. And working through that grief, I definitely learned the lesson like every day is a gift, every single day. And throughout the course of my life, having other friends, either with military dying, serving in the military, or other diseases hitting people at a young age. I mean, we all experience that throughout our lives, but I think that young experience just formed this lesson like today's a gift. Let's make something meaningful out of it. And when I was making different decisions in my life as an adult, I would often say to my family, friends, staff, I'd be like, look, if this is the last 2 years of my life, is this the highest and best use of it? And people be like, stop talking like that. And I said, no, I mean it. I mean it like, I don't mean it in a morbid way. I'm just saying like, hey, what an opportunity we have to be here. Let's make sure we're doing something purposeful and meaningful with it. So I'd always make my decisions based on that as well. Strategic decisions. Obviously, you got to put out the trash and do the dishes, even if today may be your last day. So there's very mundane things we all have to do in life, but keeping that kind of strategic perspective of gratitude and saying you're sorry when you need to, and not letting time go by before telling people who you love that you love them, and just doing those in the moment when it comes to you, I think is just really important.
One of the things that you wrote was, I learned to succeed by becoming one of the boys. Is there a cost and a benefit to that?
Yes, I think, again, I was young and the environment was pretty harsh and quite hostile at times, as they were integrating women in the Air Force Academy, but then later into fighters. Think about this. The culture really matters. And I know this now, having been a squadron commander, a colonel, a leader. But at the time when they finally opened up fighters to women, we had a 4-star general in charge of the entire Air Force. His job, is to make sure we've got the best Air Force ready to go defend America. And he had testified before Congress that he didn't want women in fighters. He didn't want the law to change. They asked him, and I'm paraphrasing, would you rather take a less qualified man over a more qualified woman? And he said, yes. And so now the policy is changing. There's a picture, I'll send it to you, Pat. There's a picture of me, front page, I forgot what newspaper it was. There's 3 of us in a press conference who they had identified. We earned a fighter. We just couldn't pick it because we were women, since the law changed. And we were there with this 4-star general at this press conference where they were announcing they're opening fighters to women. And we can't stand this guy, right? Because he's not advocated for women to be able to serve in this capacity, even when they're more qualified. So we're standing there and I've got this really like on purpose, my body language is like arms folded, giving him side eyes. People can do an internet search to find the photo, but it's hilarious. I was on purpose after all the media training where they were like, watch your body language. I'm like, yeah, you'll watch my body language. This is live. You can't tell me what to do. But then we transitioned into fighters and leadership matters and culture matters. So he set the tone that if somebody was resistant to it, like it was okay. And so I just decided, again, it was a tough environment. It was, alcohol, womenizing, pinups behind people's desks. Like it was a bit of a crazy, use your imagination of those days of how juvenile it was in so many ways. And I just decided, like, I think that's ridiculous. I don't think that means you're being an officer and a warrior means any of that. But I'm not here to change you. I'm just here to serve. And so I'm going to do what I can to show I can fly the jet. It doesn't, plane doesn't matter if you're a girl or a boy, and I'm going to blend in and be one of the guys. And it was a survival mechanism, which I look back, and it allowed me to perform and allowed me to, um, you know, thrive. But yeah, I had to kill a bit of myself temporarily, if that makes sense. The more feminine side of me. I mean, I'm an action oriented patriot and warrior. I don't think those are masculine qualities, but I basically decided I needed to just, prove them wrong and just, kind of put my head down and grind it out. I think, later on, we had another woman join our squadron. Her name was Amy Svoboda when I was in Tucson. And prior to that, I'd only been the only woman. And she unfortunately passed away in an A-10 crash in 1997, which was just devastating. But I remember when she joined the squadron, she was the environment had shifted a little bit, and she was able to kind of like, be competent and be feminine and be, balanced and all that. And I was like, wow, okay. Like she was a great example to me, even though she was younger to me, if that makes sense, to kind of be able to, bring my own personal balance back into order. But yeah, it definitely came at a cost. But at the time, I think, it wasn't a lasting cost, but at the time it was a necessary, I think, survival mechanism for me. And so I don't judge my former self over it.
Now, you once sued Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, didn't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very long story, which I share in my book. But picture the environment I just shared, right? I'm trying to just be one of the guys, blend in. We deploy, show that I belong, and we deploy overseas. And I'm in Kuwait at the time. We're flying no-fly zone enforcement over Iraq, and Saddam Hussein was threatening to come south again. And so they sent over A-10s to try and, deter and to monitor all that. And so we were over there very quickly. I mean, I just barely qualified in the A-10 and we deployed. And I walked by the duty desk one day and I see this like regional newsletter, and I see this picture of what I thought was like a local Muslim woman. And I was taken aback by like, what are they doing? What's a picture like this doing, on the front page of this newsletter? And as I look closely, it was, this is the appropriate way to wear the abaya and a gown and headscarf when off base in Saudi Arabia. And it was an American servicewoman wearing this full black Muslim gown and headscarf paid for by the taxpayer. And I was just like, I was just shocked that, I mean, I understand cultural sensitivity. We don't need to be ugly Americans, but there's a difference between don't shake with your left hand or show the bottom of your foot to imposing 7th century norms where women are property on our own people while they're serving over there. So this really bothered me in my soul, but it didn't apply to me. But I just felt this conviction like, oh my gosh, that's wrong. So I started looking into it and had to make a decision, because my first decision in this 8-year battle was the previous Secretary of Defense, Secretary Perry, was coming over to the region. And since I was the first woman in US history to deploy as a fighter pilot and to be flying combat missions, there was some media, he wanted to, visit with me, and some media wanted to talk to me. And so I was struggling with whether I should bring this up. It didn't apply to me, but I just felt like it was wrong. And as I struggled with it, because the last thing I really wanted to do was bring up some like women's issue, because that would sort of go against everything I was trying to do, right? See, we told you we shouldn't let women into these squadrons. Look at the trouble they're making. I really struggled, but I discovered, as I sought some advice from a mentor, He told me to read the book of Esther in the Old Testament. So this will be a little homework for your listeners. And as I read the book, I won't tell you the whole story, but there was a decision she had to make. And her cousin says to her, who raised her, she was an orphan, can it be that you were put in this position for such a time as this? It's Esther 4:14. And when I read that verse, it just spoke to me. Like, could it be that I was given these opportunities to, fulfill my dreams, to become a fighter pilot, to all the things that I was dreaming to do, not just so I could serve and do this, but because I had a voice for the young enlisted women who weren't going to talk to the Secretary of Defense. Could it be that I was put in this position so that I could stand on this issue? And so I decided to speak up on it, and it ended up being an 8-year battle, including them ordering me over to Saudi Arabia 6 years later, threatening to court-martial me if I didn't put the burqa on and sit in the backseat of the car, me making multiple efforts to change it within the bureaucracy. This was the U.S. military doing it to its own people. There's a little punchline for everybody. The State Department wasn't mandating this for the U.S. women serving over there. In fact, they were against it. And in the end, I filed a lawsuit against the Secretary of Defense and then worked with the legislative branch. So again, you'll have to read Dare to Fly to get the whole story, but I put my career on the line. It's not a good career move to sue the Secretary of Defense, Martha McSally versus Donald Rumsfeld. But it was the right thing to do. I was taught as a kid growing up, but I was also taught in the military, the Air Force Academy, that leadership and courage means moral courage, which also means doing the right thing, even if it comes at a cost. And my oath of office is to the Constitution, not to, stupid and unconstitutional policies of the people above me. And so I had to stand my ground and keep making difficult decisions. But in the end, it was the right thing to do, and I'd do it again.
At the time, did you think you would go on and be a member of Congress?
Oh, Lord, no. No, no, no. It's funny, some people love politics. I can't stand. I joke that I left the military apart because it was too political, but I ended up. So one of my career development opportunities as a major was a legislative fellowship. So I got the opportunity. It was just a small number of people who got selected instead of going off to what we call command and staff college. This is kind of like, grooming people to be in higher leadership. Was to work on Capitol Hill for a year to see how military defense, national security policy is made in that branch of the government. And I was on the team of Senator John Kyle from Arizona, of all people. And I went there thinking politicians, like most Americans, were not very smart or hardworking or of good character. And whether you agreed or disagreed with Senator Kyle, he was very well respected as a statesman, working across the aisle, and really hardworking man of character. And that experience helped me later with my burqa battle, as I call it, the burqa battle, because I understood how the legislative branch worked and typed up legislation to tack on to the annual defense bill and figured out how to get sponsors and went on a one-woman lobbying campaign as a citizen on military leave to address this issue of how our servicewomen were being treated in Saudi Arabia. So that helped for sure. But I did not leave that thinking like, oh, I would like to do this someday. It just, I can't stand politics. But I found myself later, after I retired from the military, I just found myself, yelling at the television, like, what's the matter with those people? Can't they get their act together? And it's just a part of who I am to not walk by a problem. And it's a part of the culture I was in the military that if you're complaining about something, you better be willing to do something about it. And so I, decided to serve in that new combat zone in Washington, D.C. in order to kind of bring, the core values that I served with in the Air Force into that crazy place to try and be in the arena to make a difference. But not because I liked politics, that's for sure.
Well, Senator Kyle said that you would learn a lot about yourself running for office. What did you learn?
He did. When I first called him, he said, "You will, regardless of what happens, you will learn a lot about yourself." I think, I had, fundamental values and beliefs generally about our country and our freedoms and our way of life. And I certainly was willing to put my life on the line, and did put my life on the line for those things that I hold so dear. Thinking through the implications of your philosophy on things and the role of government for yourself. Sometimes it's like, well, this is where I grew up, and this is what my parents taught me, or this is what other people think in my Facebook group or whatever. It's just like, no, what do you believe? And then how does that translate with what you're trying to do to serve others? And so I learned a lot about many different issues that I'd never even thought about before, and how they were impacting so many people that I never would have met had I not run. People with different life experiences, farmers and ranchers and small business owners, and people working on the edge of poverty as single parents. Like, I just learned so much, and I was so inspired by the amazing stories of the people who I was aspiring and eventually did represent. And I learned that it was really important to take the core values that I had embodied through my time in the military and put a stake in the ground about those as you're serving in a really crazy environment, dysfunctional environment, and impact on your decision-making process, to make sure you're doing the right thing, what's right for the country, what's right for your constituents. And a lot of people make decisions based on what's politically expedient for them, but I just can only speak for myself. So, grounding myself in those core values in a different way of serving in a pretty rough environment. I think my experiences in the military and as a woman in the military actually helped me to have thick skin in the process and not take things so personally, but not lose your humanity. So that was part of, I think, my maturity of having to deal with the just how brutal politics is, as you're just trying to serve. And so, yeah, you learn what you're made of. That's for sure. And I literally had to have, when I finally got there, I kept using the word frustration more than anything. I kept using that word in the first 6 months. I was like, wait, I have the opportunity and the honor to serve. And I had to get out and run the National Mall once a week just to continue to keep my perspective, run by the World War II Memorial, around the Washington Monument. I used to say, I got to go see Abe. I'd run up to the Lincoln Memorial. I'd, look back at the Capitol and release my frustration and say a prayer for whatever we were dealing with in the country and ourselves, and just replace that frustration with gratitude. And I had to do that sometimes on an hourly basis. And so those habit patterns were really important for me to not let frustration brew in me as I was dealing with the dysfunction in DC.
I think gratitude is so important in terms of framing your life.
I agree. And I will tell you, I've learned from some mentors. I feel like I've had a heart of gratitude of even awful things that have happened to me, right? Being grateful for the lessons that you learned and how it built your resilience and your grit. More recently, I've been building daily habits about spending time in the morning or in the evening. People have different habits about being mindful about the things that you're grateful for that day, even the very mundane things, right? Just sometimes they can be big things. Sometimes it can be very mundane things that are very important in the moment. And just having that spirit and that decision to have a heart of gratitude, it impacts your mental health, your physical health, your spiritual health, and it impacts everybody around you. To just look through the lens of gratitude instead of another lens, which is not positive and uplifting. So I'm super intentional about it in my daily rituals now. It's really impactful.
Want to hear more of the conversation? Sign up at bumpintheroad.us as a Bump 2 subscriber. Buy us a cup of coffee. You can give it a go for free. Just use the code FREEMONTH. And thank you for listening today. I hope you found something in today's podcast that inspires you along your own life's path, because sometimes a bump in the road is actually a portal into a more conscious and meaningful life.